This is the file they tried to erase, not hide, not bury, erase. And if you're watching this, you've probably already seen fragments of it already. Grainy low-light footage moving like a virus through Telegram, Signal, and the darkest corners of X. But you haven't heard the full story because the part that changes everything isn't the video alone, it's the audio. The audio that turns what was framed as a chaotic shooting into something colder, cleaner, and far harder to defend. Because as of this morning, Friday, January 30th, 2026, the official narrative surrounding the death of nurse Sarah Jenkins in Minneapolis hasn't simply cracked, it has been obliterated. And it happened the moment an activist collective calling itself the Glass House dropped 4 terabytes of encrypted material onto the open web, and buried inside that data dump was a folder labeled Jenkins Kill Confirmed, a title that feels like a taunt, like a stamp, like someone signing their name on the truth they knew would survive the cleanup. And what's inside proves Sarah Jenkins was kneeling, proves she was identifying herself as medical personnel, and most terrifyingly captures a command voice in an agent's earpiece giving a direct order: clear the board, take the shot. 3 words that have transformed a manslaughter case into a conspiracy, reaching far beyond one trigger pull. And in this deep dive special report, we're going to walk through that leak frame by frame, analyze the voice that authorized the kill, expose the 3 URAM panic inside the West Wing as the administration realized the cover-up had failed, and explain why the Joint Chiefs of Staff are suddenly refusing to answer the president's calls. Because the cover-up is over, the unraveling has begun, and Donald Trump knows it. To understand the magnitude of this leak, you have to understand the security surrounding these files, because the federal rapid response teams deployed to Minneapolis were not using standard police body cams. They were using military-grade Axon X systems designed to eliminate lost footage as a possibility, meaning these devices don't simply record to a local card that can be pocketed or misplaced. They stream encrypted video live to a command infrastructure in Washington, D.C., and redundantly to a DHS server farm in Virginia. So when the shooting happened Tuesday night, the White House didn't need a local report to know what the cameras captured. They knew immediately. And according to whistleblowers speaking to major outlets, an order moved through the system within minutes to quarantine the footage, which is the digital equivalent of burning tapes in the old world, because the file was pulled from active storage, shoved into deep partitions accessible only by top secret clearance holders, metadata scrubbed, logs deleted, and to everyone outside that chain of custody, the footage effectively stopped existing, which is why the sudden appearance of a folder called Kill Confirmed feels like a deliberate slap in the face of that entire machinery. And here's the twist that makes this leak different from the usual Hollywood myth of hacking, because the Glass House didn't break into the server, they broke into the stream. The rush to deploy these federal units meant key rotation discipline slipped. The encryption keys for the live uplink weren't rotated on schedule, and a mid-level IT contractor inside DHS, someone who likely watched what happened live on a monitor in a quiet room and then had to carry that image in their head, built a mirrored backdoor of the feed, not a smash and grab, a silent parallel capture. And the reason the footage didn't surface instantly is because the contractor waited, as if testing whether the system still had a conscience, as if giving power one final chance to tell the truth before the truth had to be forced into daylight. And according to the timeline circulating in the leak community, the moment that broke the dam was the tweet that branded Sarah Jenkins a terrorist enabler. Because that wasn't just spin, it was moral inversion. It was the state trying to turn the victim into the villain. And that was the moment the contractor pulled the trigger by uploading the file to Arweave, a blockchain-based storage network built around permanence, the kind of permanence that terrifies institutions built on deletion. Because once a file is on Arweave, it cannot be removed. It cannot be censored. It can't be cleaned. It just sits there like a fossil of truth embedded in the internet itself. And at 2 now a.m., the link hit multiple platforms simultaneously: 4chan, Reddit, Discord, and within minutes, the traffic spike set off alarms inside the White House cybersecurity ecosystem. And by the time they tried to choke the network with DDoS attacks, the Streisand effect was already in motion, because millions had already mirrored and downloaded it, and the evidence they wanted erased was trending globally. Warning, what we are about to describe is graphic, because it is documentation of a killing, and the file itself is 12 minutes long, beginning at 8:35 p.m., 7 minutes before the shot, with the camera perspective coming from the chest-mounted unit of the shooter, identified in the metadata only as Agent 734. And this matters because the audio is crisp enough to contradict the official story on its own. You can hear breathing. You can hear the chant from the crowd, "Go away, go away." But you can also hear something that doesn't belong in a scene of imminent danger. Casualness, even amusement, because tear gas canisters arc through the air and the agent laughs and says, "That's a hit," to the person beside him. And that single line detonates the claim that agents were under heavy assault, because voices under assault don't sound like they're at a range. And then the smoke clears in a way that feels like the entire story holding its breath. A figure breaks from the crowd. The low light sensor adjusts, and you can see blue scrubs. You can see the white medical cross on a backpack. You can see Sarah Jenkins moving with urgency toward a fallen teenager, and she kneels, hands raised, identifying herself. And in that moment, the agent raises his rifle, and you see the red dot of the holographic sight settle on her chest with horrifying steadiness. And then comes the audio that changes everything. Agent 734 says, "Target is obstructing the arrest." Medic markings. And there's a pause that feels like a doorway opening, because a voice cuts in through the earpiece, distorted but intelligible, and the language is clinical, almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. Is she securing the HVT? And when Agent 734 replies, "Negative," she is flushing eyes. She's in the open. The command voice doesn't hesitate. It doesn't ask for de-escalation. It doesn't ask for restraint. It says, "We cannot lose the target. Clear the board, authorized." And Agent 734 responds, "Copy." Green light. And then the shot happens. The camera jerks from recoil. Sarah Jenkins collapses. The crowd screams. And what happens next is what destroys every possible mistake defense, because the shooter does not rush to help, does not call for a medic, does not check on the person he just dropped. He lowers the weapon and says, "Threat neutralized," as if the most important thing is not the human being on the pavement, but the completion of a task. This footage annihilates every public justification that followed, because the claim that she was charging collapses under the visual of her kneeling. The claim that it was accidental collapses under the fact that he asked for permission and received it. The claim that she was a terrorist collapses under the fact that he identified her as a medic before firing, and that forces the conversation into a far darker place, because it no longer looks like the actions of a single rogue agent acting out of panic. It looks like a system that decided a medical worker was an obstacle and processed her like a problem to be removed. And that is why the internet is now obsessed with one question: who is the voice on the radio? Because the leak community and multiple independent analysts are arguing that the voice does not match the local tactical commander on the ground, and signal latency suggests remote direction, which implies a command center in Washington, D.C. And if that's true, the chain of command becomes the story, not the trigger finger. And then the leak turns from murder to cover-up, because the dump includes server logs that read like a crime scene timeline, a flurry of privileged access commands beginning within minutes of the shooting, deletion requests, overwrite directives, and the kind of wipe the drive behavior that only appears when someone isn't trying to reduce clutter, they're trying to destroy evidence. And the implication being pushed by the narrative is that these actions originated from inside the executive office of the president network space, which is why in this story world, the morning feels like panic, because it's not just about what happened in Minneapolis, it's about what happened after, who reached for the delete key, who thought the truth could be erased, because murder has no statute of limitations, and digital fingerprints don't disappear. And when the lawyers in the building start resigning and hiring their own lawyers, that tells you everyone can smell how quickly the ground is shifting. Trump's response in this narrative is exactly what you'd expect from someone whose survival depends on controlling perception. He doesn't defend the details. He attacks reality itself. He claims it's AI. He calls it a deep fake. He insists the real tape can't be released for national security, and that tactic is designed for one purpose: to make the audience doubt their own eyes long enough for the system to regain control. But the reason that defense collapses is because the file's technical footprint, as described, is too cohesive to hand-wave away, because it carries device-level signatures, embedded telemetry, GPS markers, gyroscopic movement data that syncs with other footage, and the kind of metadata that doesn't just make a video look real, it makes it behave real, like it lived inside a physical moment. And the deeper the public learns how those signatures work, the smaller the AI escape hatch becomes, which is why the narrative shifts to a new front. Not the internet, but the Pentagon. The most dangerous development for Trump isn't the outrage online, it's institutional refusal. Because the moment the Joint Chiefs view a clip like this, the argument becomes existential. Because the public can't always distinguish between a soldier and a militarized federal agent. And when a force dressed like war spills into domestic streets and commits something that looks like a war crime, it stains the uniform whether or not the uniform was present. And in this story, that's why the chiefs call emergency meetings, why stand down and illegal orders start appearing in whispers. Because if the president attempts to escalate, attempts to invoke extraordinary domestic powers, the military has to decide whether it follows or quarantines. And that's what makes the situation feel like the system protecting itself from a criminal executive. Not through tanks, but through refusal, through silence, through unanswered calls. And then the protests transform into something almost surreal, because they stop being crowds and become projectors. Because in this narrative, the leaked video is played on loop against the walls of power itself, the murder displayed 50 feet tall against the executive office building, the words, "Clear the board," authorized, booming through speakers, forcing an administration built on messaging to stare at an image it cannot spin away, because you can't tweet over a projection of your own crisis. You can only endure it, and that is the psychological siege. The truth occupying physical space, the truth turning architecture into a screen, the truth refusing to be contained in press releases. The leak becomes a turning point because it collapses the timeline of cover-ups, because what once took years now takes hours, because the moment the file is mirrored across millions of devices, the state loses its monopoly on the evidence, and the story shifts into a regime-level crisis where protests grow, lawyers flee, institutions fracture, and every attempt to call it fake only deepens the suspicion that the real crime isn't just the shooting, it's the desperation to bury it. And that's why the final hook lands. Glass House claims this was only file 1. They say more is coming. They hint at file 2. And whether or not that's true doesn't even matter at first, because the threat alone changes behavior. It makes people in the building act like hunted animals. It makes allies distance themselves. It makes enemies smell blood. And it turns the public into an audience that can't look away, because the story isn't about what might happen someday. It's about what is already out there, already downloaded, already seen, already permanent. And now the Senate enters the frame in a way that feels less like politics and more like self-preservation. Because when polling swings violently, when support for impeachment jumps overnight into the danger zone, the calculation becomes simple. Senators stop thinking about loyalty and start thinking about survival. And in this narrative, you hear the echoes of the Goldwater moment. Senior party figures walking into the White House not to negotiate policy, but to deliver a verdict. You don't have the votes, you can't survive a trial, you need to resign. And the president, cornered, pivots to Civil War language, tries to activate fear and militias and mythology, but the base fractures because even the most anti-government wing cannot reconcile a government agent killing an unarmed nurse, because that is the nightmare of the "don't tread on me" identity. And when that wing feels betrayed, the strongman loses the fringe. And when the fringe loses faith, the megaphone starts sounding like panic rather than power, because the truth in high resolution doesn't just expose a crime, it exposes weakness. And that is the real reason this story holds attention. It isn't merely a leak, it's the speed of information ripping the mask off the speed of tyranny. It's a system built on denial collapsing under a file it cannot delete. It's the president yelling fake while the world watches a sequence that feels painfully, physically real, and the gap between the two becomes a canyon. And once that canyon opens, everything starts sliding into it. Protests, lawyers, institutions, alliances, and the sense that the cover-up didn't just fail, it backfired. It turned a single tragedy into a regime-ending crisis. And if Glass House is telling the truth, if there really is a file 2, then the next drop won't just intensify outrage, it will finalize outcomes. Because in a world where the evidence is permanent and the audience is millions, power doesn't fall slowly, it falls all at once. And the only question left is whether the next crack happens by Monday.